Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. In a significant development, Iran has preconditioned the removal of the so-called snapback mechanism in its nuclear accord in the event of new talks with world powers. Under the 2015 deal, Iran agreed to curb its nuclear work in return for relief from US and other sanctions. The accord includes the option of a snapback of UN sanctions if Iran breaches the deal. That includes suspending all nuclear enrichment-related and reprocessing activities, including research development. This trigger mechanism must be abandoned as an irrational principle in the event of further negotiations. Ali Akbar Velayati, a top advisor to Ali Khamenei, said in an interview posted on the Supreme Leader's website. The demand comes at a time when world powers and Iran have weeks to revive the 2015 nuclear deal. Tehran has already begun to enrich uranium at higher levels, and Iran's parliament has threatened to curb the access of UN inspectors next month. Meanwhile, on Tuesday, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that al-Qaeda had established a new home base in Iran and that it was time, and I quote from what he said, for America and all free nations to crush the Iran-al-Qaeda axis, unquote. He provided no evidence for this claim, and terrorism experts voiced skepticism about Pompeo's claims. According to Reuters, most experts said that it has long been known that senior al-Qaeda operatives were given refuge in Iran, but that Pompeo was exaggerating that the group has made Iran its new home base. Iran, for its part, has rejected Pompeo's comments as warmongering lies. Let's get to our panel to figure out what's going on. I'm joined by Syed Mostapha Khoshcheshm. Mr. Khoshcheshm is a journalist and analyst. He's taught at a number of Iranian universities and academic centers, including the International Relations faculty of the Iranian Foreign Ministry. I also have with me Dr. Sameer Lalwani, senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. Let me begin with Mr. Khoshcheshm here. Mr. Khoshcheshm, this seems interesting to me. Is this a signal to the world powers that perhaps, including the incoming Biden administration, that in the event of fresh talks, Iran would want the snapback sanctions option to be off the table?
True. Since Joe Biden won the election, Iran has been stressing on three things for a revival of the JCPOA. Tehran has stressed that the U.S. should remove the sanctions first by showing respect for the contents of UN Resolution 2231. That means a removal of all sanctions, secondary nuclear-related sanctions mentioned under the JCPOA. In a second step, Tehran says then it would require the U.S. to make up for the losses it has incurred on Iranian economy by its withdrawal from the JCPOA, and there needs to be talks over how much this damage and compensation for the damages should be and how they should be provided to Iran. And the third thing that Iran has requested is that Tehran now needs assurances that the United States would not go for the trigger mechanism if it gets back to the JCPOA, because the United States has proved to be an untrustworthy partner to the nuclear deal. It has already withdrawn from the deal so easily, even without resorting to the mechanism, to the trigger mechanism. And while it was out of the JCPOA, it tried to initiate the trigger mechanism, though it failed at the end of summer, as we all witnessed. So Tehran says that if it's to get back to the nuclear deal first, all sanctions should be removed. But once it revives its undertakings that it has suspended already, including limiting the stockpile of its uranium enriched to 300 kilograms and oxidate the stockpiles or turn them into fuel rods and fuel plates, then there should be guarantees that the U.S. would not get out of the JCPOA again, because these stockpiles are very precious and Iran has limited resources, limited uranium ore and mines. And if the United States tries to play with Iran again and again and again, one day Tehran would not have sufficient, volume of uranium ore to produce enriched uranium. So Tehran wants insurances. But before anything else, it's the issue with the removal of sanctions. That's a very complicated thing because maybe you're out of time or short of time, so I can elaborate on that because
I'll get to that.
Biden.
I'll get to that, Mr. Khoshcheshm. Let me, since you've mentioned the three important conditions that Tehran wants with reference to, getting back to the JCPOA, I just want to get a sense from Samir Lalwani of how Washington is likely to play this. Samir, the reason I'm saying this is that from what is being said, it's kind of akin to, analogically speaking, it's like whether you look at the hard point of the message or the soft point of the message. So what Iran is saying with reference to guarantees is something which makes sense given how the U.S. under President Trump just simply walked out of the JCPOA. So just give me a sense of how Washington under the new administration is likely to play this.
I think as many things in life, guarantees in international politics are hard to come by. I think what you can do is maybe offer costly signals. So one of the things about the JCPOA that was done for political expediency, but may not have sort of had long-term durability, was that it was largely an executive branch agreement. There was a vote I believe in the Senate, but I don't think it involved the same level or the same degree of consult and bringing Congress on board. I think there could have probably been a lot more legislation to make it more binding. And that's perhaps what Iran is suggesting, right, is that there's going to have to be something more durable than the commitment of the executive, because the executive branch shifts from every 4 years or every 8 years. That agreement isn't as durable. So I think that's plausible. My guess, though, is at least in sort of the near term, the Biden administration is not going to think, it would take sort of like a year's worth of political capital to get a major piece of legislation on Iran to re-enter the JCPOA passed. That's not going to be the Biden administration's priority. We obviously have significant domestic challenges at home that need to be attended to first. So I think it's going to probably be the Biden administration pursuing a return back to the JCPOA. It's also not clear to me that the statement by the Khamenei's advisor was specific to a return to the JCPOA versus a new agreement. I think, the snapback sanctions were baked into the JCPOA, so I don't know if that's an indication or perhaps even a bargaining position that Iran's putting out there. I think some of these things are surmountable, right? Like the compensation request, I guess you could sort of argue from the Iranian perspective is an understandable request or sort of, demand. I think these things could also be pushed down the line, right? The compensation doesn't have to happen immediately. It could happen over, several years. And so if you're able to sort of shift time horizons for some of these things, it makes it a more tractable bargain. But I ultimately think what this is both an indication that's positive, as you said, that Iran is willing to return to some agreements with the United States and the international community on enrichment issues, which is of foremost concern for a lot of these parties. But at the same time, it's taking its bargaining position, which I would expect nothing less. And I think the United States will see that as the opening gambit of a bargain or discussion rather than set terms baked in.
Right. Just get a sense of what the approach is inside the Beltway, especially among policymakers. I know Iran is not particularly a state that's liked in Washington, D.C., but I'm talking about the hardcore, pragmatic policymakers approaching it, not so much with reference to whether they like or do not like Iran, but more in terms of the benefits, sort of win-win situation for all sides.
Yeah, this is a little bit tougher than it was 12 years ago. I think when the Obama administration came in 2008, Iran was a very high priority, both generally and in terms of the foreign policy agenda. I think today, when the Biden administration is coming in, it's overwhelmingly its priorities are domestic for obvious reasons. But then I think in the foreign policy space, there are much bigger fish to fry, right? There's going to be, I think many administration officials or transition officials have indicated that China is going to be at the top of the list. There's an expiring New START agreement with Russia that's probably going to take high priority. So I imagine those things are going to float to the top. And there's certainly a strong interest in the incoming administration to return to the JCPOA. But it depends on, whether there's the parties are amenable to, again, a return, or if it's going to be sort of a new negotiation. Again, I don't think there's going to be several years spent on this like there was in the Obama administration. I don't think sort of an interim freeze for freeze kind of agreement that was done in the Obama administration would be viable today. You talked about hardcore, pragmatic policymakers who don't particularly care for Iran but are going to make a deal. I mean, I think the problem is that's an oxymoron, right? There are hardcore advocates of a very hardline pressure campaign with Iran within the Beltway that have had sort of an outsized voice. And then there's sort of the more pragmatic-minded policymakers who are concerned about a whole bunch of equities. This is the classic collective action, Mankiw-Olson dilemma. So I think you're going to have still very strong vocal opponents of any return to the JCPOA coming from still a more hardline, neoconservative, thinking about certain Arab and Israeli allies perspective. And
yeah, I certainly wasn't talking about that bunch at all, Samir. Perhaps I should have said the structural realists or the realists. But thank you so much. That was insightful. Gave us a sense of what's likely to happen and what one should expect. Thank you, Samir Lalwani. Let me go back to Mostapha Khoshcheshm. Mr. Khoshcheshm, you heard Dr. Lalwani talk about the interest in the Biden administration, incoming Biden administration, of going back to the JCPOA, but also then, of course, various other hurdles in terms of focus on the domestic agenda, in terms of the priority list and the rest of it. So in the interim, as I said in my opening weeks before Iran has to decide what it really wants to do. So what is your sense of what that approach would be? For instance, would Iran carry through on the parliament's threat of throwing out the UN inspectors, or do you think some kind of modus vivendi could be worked out?
Yes, sure. Before that, let me make reference to what your other guest said. An approval by the Congress could make the JCPOA more durable, but still it's not a guarantee, because we've all seen that Donald Trump, how easily he discarded the United States agreements with Russia, the INF, also membership in UNESCO or in WHO, and over a dozen other agreements. Some of them had the approval of the Congress and for decades, like membership in UNESCO. But that would not provide Tehran with good guarantees. Honestly, I believe that Tehran should also think domestically on the domestic circles what kind of guarantee it wants from the United States to make sure that even if they stand outside the nuclear deal, they still have allies in Europe that could go for the trigger mechanism. So there needs to be, more thinking about that. About the damages that Iran is requesting, that should not necessarily happen in terms of money. This could happen by canceling the United States sanctions on Iran's use of dollar-based, transactions known as the U-turn. If they allow Iran to get back and make use of the U-turn for dollar-based transactions, that could be a part of, the compensation. But with reference to your question, what matters to Tehran is the removal of sanctions. Which sanctions? The sanctions mentioned under the JCPOA. Paragraphs 23 to 26 stress that the EU as well as the US are not allowed to reinstate the sanctions, the secondary nuclear-related sanctions, under different pretexts like terrorism, like missile industries, and so on and so forth. This is what the U.S. administration, the Donald Trump administration, has been doing all throughout the past 2 or 3 years. So what Iran wants is a removal of sanctions based on JCPOA, which means a cancellation and removal, annulment of all the sanctions imposed on the nation in the past 4 years. So this, I believe, is going to be the bone of contention between Iran and the United States. And Biden should make a decision, because I believe, my assessment, final words, Tehran has made its assessment, and it has already made its decision. It's very tough and very much resolved to go ahead with the parliament approval, and it's going to act. It was to do it. It was to resume 20% enrichment in about a month from now, according to the parliament approval. But it has already started resumption of 20% enrichment. This shows that Iran is not kidding. It's very serious and resolved to go ahead with the rest of this parliament approval, which includes expelling the IAEA inspectors, of course, under the additional protocol, not all inspectors. Iran is going to stop only the voluntary implementation of the additional protocol to the NPT, and it's not going to stop.
That's an important distinction. Thank you for making that distinction. Stay with me, Mr. Khoshcheshm. I am also joined by David Herszenhorn, who's Chief Brussels Correspondent of Politico. David, thank you so much for being on the program. Last time we spoke, we pretty much talking about Iran and Iranian options. Now, this time, this particular statement about, saying that, look, you have to remove this snapback mechanism, trigger mechanism, in the event of any new talks. So the United States can either look at the soft part of the signal or the hard part of the signal. Now, give me your sense of how it's likely to play out in terms of the interpretation of this signal.
Well, hello, Ajaz, and salam, Mostapha. We should keep in mind, and I'm in Brussels, the European perspective of the EU and also now the UK, which has left the EU, the E3 powers, which, of course, together with Russia and China are guarantors of this nuclear agreement. And the U.S. is not the only party here. And so keep in mind that the EU, which has issued statements recently saying it wants both the return of the U.S. to the agreement, but also the return of Iran to full compliance. These other partners have essentially been victims of Trump's policies as much as Tehran. And I understand that it's difficult for Iran to see that, but it should be clear that the expectation of the other parties is that both Iran will come back to full compliance and the U.S. will re-enter the accord, but not that there would be this kind of a fundamental hollowing out of the agreement by removing the possibility of snapback sanctions. Remember, the U.S. was demanding snapback sanctions, and the position of the other guarantors of the agreement was that by leaving the JCPOA, the U.S. no longer had the legal standing within the United Nations Security Council to make that kind of a demand. Right. So there will be a very tough negotiation, as you say, but I think it's unrealistic on Tehran's part to expect such a giant compromise on the part of China, Russia, the UK, France, Germany, who are equal guarantors of this agreement along with the US.
I agree with you, and that is where I believe that if Iran, and Mostapha Khoshcheshm made a distinction that the IAEA inspectors under the additional protocol will be thrown out, but even that, to me, seems to be a move that could put a lot of pressure on the EU partners, as also on China and Russia, in terms of these states being the guarantors of this JCPOA. Is that something? And could that be a sort of make and break event? What is your sense of that?
We need to be very careful about reading too much into any of this, what we would call throat clearing or initial maneuvering before the parties re-enter formal discussions and talks. I think you have a lot of stage setting going on. Of course, Tehran wants to set certain parameters to draw some red lines if it can. We see that the EU and Joseph Borrell, the EU's foreign policy chief, trying to do that as well with his statement saying they expect a return of the U.S. and full return to compliance by Iran. In fact, I would caution to be just a little bit careful about analyzing this too much, because once they go back into a meeting, once they go back to the table, remember, coming into this Biden administration, you have two of the best minds in the U.S. on this deal. Wendy Sherman, who will be at the Department of State, Jake Sullivan, who will be the National Security Advisor. And so when you think about the expertise that is coming to bear, these are folks who are not unfamiliar with the terms. I know from having talked to some of them, they know all of the details of this agreement, and they will be ready to discuss that across the board with all of the partners. So at this point, if we haven't seen the JCPOA fall apart, which we haven't, that's a credit to Joseph Borrell and the various partners who have kept it on what we would say life support through this time, through an American election that didn't have a clear result right away, but quickly did show that Joe Biden would come in with a possibility of resuscitating this agreement. Now, once they get into the room, we'll see the real negotiation. This preliminary huffing and puffing is to be expected, but I would be very surprised if anything right now, short of an absolute breach, would disrupt the possibility of at least getting the initial conversation going. And then once they're in the room, it's a whole different ball game, as we would say.
Excellent points. Let me, before I wrap up, quickly go back to Mr. Khoshcheshm. Mr. Khoshcheshm, David has made some really brilliant points with reference to how this is likely to play out, but it also means Tehran has to play it very cautiously and not push everyone to the wall.
Well, let me be honest with you. Tehran has waited long. It pursued the kind of strategy, they called it, patience, strategic patience, and they took no action, against the increasing hostilities shown by the Donald Trump administration. But now, at the end of the 2 years of maximum pressure policy, as the maximum efficiency period of the sanctions ended in May, and as Tehran is picking up, with its economy, it's exporting more and more crude as well as petrol to many countries, and it's earning a heck of a money through these exports right now. And as Iranian economy is picking up and it's shown positive rates, Tehran now has shifted its strategy for active resistance. It's a few months Iran has been pursuing this strategy because it has received nothing in return for its patience so far.
I agree with you. I agree with you. I agree with you, but here's the point. I mean, this strategy, a shifting of gears from passive to active resistance, definitely at the end of it, Tehran's expectation should be for the sanctions to be lifted, for JCPOA to be restored. And I think that's the point that David is trying to make here in terms of, Tehran's approach to it. A little more patience, perhaps, would be in order.
No, as a matter of fact, I look at all these moves made by both Tehran as well as the Biden administration as moves before, the day when everything should start, because they are gathering points, they are gathering, they are using more and more leverage. There is a willpower between the two sides. Tehran has its own conditions, the triple agreement conditions that I just said, and Biden has said also that he would get back to the deal only if Tehran agrees to renegotiate the sunset clauses, as well as agreements on its ballistic missile program, regional clout, as well as human rights issues, and so on and so forth. And he has also asked guarantees that Iran would go to the end of the road. There is a willpower, and both sides are trying to maximize their pressures on each other. So I think.
Right. Let me take that quietly, Mr. Khoshcheshm. I'm running out of time, but let me quickly take this point back to David here. David, very quickly before I wrap up.
Let's just say that Tehran should keep in mind the effort of the American people, who made clear they no longer wanted Donald Trump as their president. So to try to up the demands too far, and you described there, Mostapha, some of the demands that the Biden administration has been making, we can see that as a counterbalance to the initial demands and throat clearing that we hear from Tehran. But in the end, I would predict that folks get back to the question of the JCPOA as it was narrowly defined and intended, first and foremost, to come back into that agreement to curtail any possibility of a nuclear weapons program in Iran. After that, if that goes well, the talks will then build and build. They need confidence on both sides. But until we get to that point, each side can make all this noise that it wants. But there should be some attention paid to the fact that whatever you say, the American people have shown they want a different direction, and that includes re-entering with a new president, the Paris Accords on climate or the JCPOA, lots more international engagement. It's not the point, I would think, for Iran to try to completely torpedo everything by being too ambitious.
Right. Thank you so much. That was David Herszenhorn. Thank you also to Syed Mostapha Khoshcheshm for his insights. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the killing of 11 Pakistani Hindus in India. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. In a letter addressed to the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Pakistan has demanded an investigation into the murders of 11 Pakistani Hindus in northwestern India. This family had migrated to India from Pakistan. The bodies were found in August last year in a field in Rajasthan. In September last year, Pakistan also summoned the Indian Shahzad Affair to convey its serious concern over the deaths of 11 Pakistani Hindus. The Indian envoy was told that despite repeated requests by the Pakistan High Commission in New Delhi for details about the tragic incident, the Indian government had continued to evade the issue. India has so far disclosed only scant information about the case and has failed to share any substantive details regarding the cause and circumstances of the deaths. To discuss this further, I'm joined by Justice Ali Nawaz Chohan. Justice Chohan is a former chairman of the National Commission on Human Rights. And I will also shortly be joined by Ramesh Kumar, who is a Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf member of National Assembly of Pakistan. Let me begin with Justice Chohan. Justice Chohan, what is the legal framework in and through which this kind of information is shared, and what is the responsibility of the country where the crime has taken place against the nationals of another country?
I think it's a great responsibility, and the onus is on India, who is who's being reluctant in passing on the information about the causes of the death of these 11 people of the Bhil tribe from Tharparka. Now, this includes children, this includes women, and they are just giving out stories which the superintendent there, Mr. Bharat, is trying to give out as if it were a case of suicide, but they don't have any forensic information on that. One of the ladies who was not there, she'd gone out to tend the herds. Now she survived. So the other one, who is Shri Mati Mukhi, a daughter of the head of the family, she's accusing this of execution or, let's say, murder. Why is India shrouding it all in mystery and not giving out reports about the causes of the death and why it happened? What Shrimati Mukhi is trying to tell us is that there is an ulterior motive on the part of RAW in India. They wanted to use them for some purpose against Pakistan, but failed. Now, the story of suicide doesn't help us because the children were there and then the bodies were found outside at the Lodet farm of Deche area in Jodhpur. So they were not at that spot. If it were suicide, they would have remained there. And then why would there be a collective decision for a suicide? And then one was left over. And then we are also surprised that the United Nations bodies in Delhi, it's a large number there, they have done nothing about it. They have not asked for information. And Pakistan is persistently asking for the causes of the death and for proper investigation. And India is failing.
Right. As I mentioned, that a letter has also been written to the United Nations. But here's the thing, I'm very happy, Chohan, that you talked about what Shrimati Mukhi said, because according to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs press release, it says that she has made highly concerning statements implicating the research and analysis wing in the murder of her father. For viewers, Research and Analysis Wing is India's external intelligence agency. But stay with me, Chohan. I'm also joined, as I said earlier, by Ramesh Kumar. Mr. Kumar is the PTI member of National Assembly of Pakistan. Mr. Kumar, thank you for being with us on the program. Give us some background to this, and why do you think India is so reluctant to share information about the deaths or murders, as Ms. Mukhi suggests, of this family from Pakistan?
I think this is very bad habit since long time after the partition of the countries, and this practice is still on from their side, that the intelligence agencies wants to use them as the people migrate from here for the future, better future, but when they reach, they want to use them. So this is the major issue, and I have highlighted this issue. And so we'll see soon. Tomorrow, I have requested the case in Supreme Court tomorrow, and tomorrow Supreme Court will decide about our appeal, that what should be the decision. So we'll see. I will give you detail tomorrow about this our case.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Ramesh Kumar speaking with us. Let me go back to Justice Chohan. Justice Chohan, about the legal issues. As you mentioned, India has a very heavy responsibility with reference to that. Now, what are the remedies available to Pakistan in this case, especially if India does not shoulder the responsibility that it must?
Basically, if you will kindly see that protection of citizens, or as it is called, our right to protection is a norm of the United Nations, or anybody in a particular state. So this matter can be taken before the High Commissioner of Human Rights in Geneva, and they could be apprised of this situation. There is also the global body of R24, right to protection, where this can be agitated, because there's a failure on the part of the National Commission for Human Rights in India who is also supposed to look into such problems. They haven't done it. So there's a complete failure. Now, you see, many a times Pakistan is blamed for certain things, but look at India, what they are doing, and they just try to manipulate things and hide things, and the big bodies sitting there of the human right and other refugees and all bodies in India. What are they doing? They are not doing anything. They could be easily manipulated. But we can take this issue because they are Pakistani citizens to the High Commissioner in Geneva and bring it to the notice even of the Secretary General for the failure to protect citizens of another country or people who were there. And these 11 deaths, these speak of executions and lend support to the theory which is being proffered by Mati Mukhi and also by Kamal Ram, the lady who survived. She was out from that family. So if incidentally she escaped death. So it doesn't seem to be a case of suicide, because by that time they would have answered the chemical examination through the chemical examination report, the forensic report, but they are hiding, and that gives impression of ulterior motives on the part. There's something, and that's what India keeps doing to force people to work against Pakistan.
Right. Just Chohan, very quickly, because I'm running out of time now. One final question. Mr. Kumar mentioned that this issue is also before the Supreme Court of Pakistan. So what role can the Supreme Court of Pakistan play in this?
I don't think so. The Supreme Court has jurisdiction. It's something which happened in India, and the Supreme Court here, I don't know, they may ask the Foreign Office to become more active and pursue it, but the remedy lies somewhere else, not here.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Justice Ali Nawaz Chohan speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.